The lamps flickered against the parlor walls, their glow trembling like hearts that sensed what was coming. Outside, the summer air was heavy, thick with the musk of cotton fields and the faint sourness of sweat that clung to dusk. Inside, a table was set for indulgence, silver laid, roasted meat steaming, glasses filled with amber drink that caught firelight like molten gold. To the masters, it was an ordinary night of feasting. To Elijah, it was the night of reckoning. This was Alabama, 1839. A year when newspapers spoke of prosperity, when merchants in Montgomery tallied their profits, when overseers whipped men and women into fields until their backs shone raw beneath the sun. On records, it was business as usual. Yet history hides what memory refuses to bury, a dinner where silence turned to screams, where the weight of centuries pressed down on one man until his hand could hold the blade no longer. This is not a tale written in ledgers or sung in hymns. It is whispered in fragments, pieced together from court scraps, neighbor recollections, and the yellowed ink of clippings long forgotten. And tonight we walk back into that room, where chains rattled beneath fine music and where vengeance carved its name into flesh. If you hunger for histories that bleed with truth and terror, subscribe now to the Unchained Past and step into the shadows with us. Elijah was not born to violence. Like so many enslaved in the South, his childhood dissolved into field work before his hands had even grown strong enough to carry bundles. His voice, once light with laughter, hardened into silence. Overseers recorded him as able-bodied, obedient, quiet, never noting the sharpness of his eyes nor the way he watched and listened. Quiet men were underestimated, and Elijah had learned the art of waiting. The plantation itself stretched like a kingdom, hundreds of acres of cotton, the air buzzing with cicadas and heavy with dust. The big house stood in the middle, painted white, though the wood beneath was gray with age. Its windows faced the quarters, as though to remind the enslaved each night who commanded their sleep. The quarters themselves were cramped, dark, stinking of sweat, rot, and damp straw. Children coughed through nights while parents whispered lullabies that carried more prayer than comfort. To the master's family, those quarters were invisible, except when sickness spread or punishment was required. But in 1839, Alabama whispered with unease. Rebellion had already rippled through neighboring states, small uprisings, quickly crushed, their leaders hanged in public squares. Newspapers printed warnings, keep vigilant, discipline must be maintained. Pastors thundered that obedience was divine will, while neighbors muttered of bad blood when fields grew restless. The very air of the South seemed haunted by a fear that one night the enslaved would no longer bow. In Elijah's case, the weight fell hardest during the dinners. He was forced to serve at the table, pouring wine, laying bread, carving meat, while laughter swelled around him. Every joke of the master felt like a chain tightened, every glance of the mistress like a lash across the skin. Yet he moved silently, steady hands betraying nothing. Beneath his calm, however, a plan gathered, one that would be spoken of in fragments for generations. According to a newspaper clipping preserved in a Montgomery archive, a servant testified years later that Elijah had whispered to others, "One cut and we all breathe." The phrase became a quiet prayer in the quarters, passed from mouth to mouth as though salvation itself was hidden in those words. One cut, that was all it would take. On the night of reckoning, dinner began as always. The master, swollen with drink and arrogance, barked orders while the family feasted. Outside, frogs croaked in the damp night. Inside, violins played from a cracked phonograph, their notes trembling against the walls. Elijah moved behind the master's chair, pouring wine into his cup. No one noticed the glint of steel in his sleeve. No one saw his chest rise and fall like a storm pressing against fragile shutters. The first sound was not a scream but a gasp. Steel across flesh, sudden, wet, unrelenting. The master's hand shot to his throat, red spilling between his fingers, staining the linen like spilled wine. The mistress shrieked, the children froze, the room spun into chaos. Elijah stood firm, his eyes burning with something long denied, not madness, not desperation, but a clarity sharper than the blade itself. In that instant, silence in the quarters broke into freedom. Chains rattled, doors swung, voices rose. Elijah's act was not only for himself but for everyone whose nights had been stolen, whose backs had been flayed, whose children had been sold downriver. According to fragments in a court note, the enslaved broke forth from the house, unshackled, and vanished into the woods. Whether all survived, no record is clear. But for one night, freedom roared like fire through the Alabama air. Neighbors recalled later that dogs howled unnaturally, that church bells rang without hands to pull the ropes, that smoke seemed to rise though no fire was seen. Some swore it was the devil's work, others called it divine justice. But all agreed, the big house had been broken, not by cannon or soldier, but by the hand of one man who refused silence. Was Elijah captured? Here, history grows murky. Some records claim he fled into the swamps, vanishing into the dark waters where no hounds could track him. Others whisper he was caught weeks later, hanged beneath an oak while townsfolk gathered in uneasy silence. And still others insist he walked north, blending into freedom, his name erased but his story etched into whispers. Whatever the truth, one fact remains. That night, the master's laughter was cut short, and chains loosened in ways no overseer could repair. But was Elijah a lone hand of vengeance, or part of something larger, an unseen network of resistance threading through plantations like roots beneath the soil? Could this act of rebellion have been only one spark in a fire never fully recorded? What shadows followed after that night of blood and silence? What secrets did neighbors carry, too dangerous to write in ink? The night after the blade fell, the air in Alabama was thick with dread. News traveled faster than horses. By dawn, whispers had already slipped through the quarters of neighboring plantations, carrying Elijah's name like a storm in the distance. Overseers stood straighter, pistols strapped tighter at their sides, while masters called for dogs and lanterns. A dinner turned to blood was not just an isolated crime. To them, it was contagion, a spark that could ignite every acre of cotton across the South. According to a surviving clipping from the Montgomery Advertiser, the unruly Negro had committed an act of barbarity most foul, yet the article betrayed fear more than certainty. How had Elijah slipped steel into the master's house? How had the enslaved moved so quickly to scatter, as if rehearsed? These were not questions the newspaper could answer without admitting the truth, that beneath the silence of fields, rebellion always smoldered. Neighbors spoke of that night with unease. One man recalled hearing a shrill cry as if the land itself had been cut open. Another swore that when he passed the big house the following morning, he saw blood pooled on the steps, drying to black in the heat. Servants muttered that the mistress had not spoken since, her eyes fixed only on the stain that could not be scrubbed from the floorboards. The house, once loud with orders and laughter, seemed shrunken, as though the very walls had recoiled. But outside, the world stirred with fury. Posses gathered, armed with muskets and dogs, combing through woods and swamps. They swore Elijah would not escape, nor the others who had slipped away in the chaos. Court records note the summoning of militia, a net cast wide to drag back those who dared to unchain themselves. And yet, despite the hunts, Elijah's fate remained shrouded. For every testimony that he was caught and hanged, another whispered he had vanished, slipping into the thick marsh where chains could not follow. Meanwhile, the enslaved across Alabama heard more than fear, they heard possibility. One cut, one act of defiance, and the big house had crumbled into silence. It was said that in the quarters of distant plantations, children whispered his name as though it were a charm, while elders shook their heads, muttering that such courage was either holy or cursed. Pastors thundered louder in their pulpits, warning against rebellion, insisting God's will was order. Yet even they admitted privately that Elijah's story would not die easily. The master's burial only deepened the unease. The coffin was lowered into the ground on a hot July afternoon, the churchyard thick with gnats and the odor of sweat. Some claimed that as the pastor spoke, the church bell rang once on its own, though no rope had been pulled. Others whispered that the dogs, usually restless, lay silent as stone, ears pressed flat to the earth. The grave itself seemed uneasy, as though it swallowed more than flesh, as though it swallowed the illusion of control. Hit like if this tale of vengeance chills you to the bone. Official records tried to smother the story. The court labeled it an isolated incident, the press a barbarous crime, yet silence has never erased memory. Travelers wrote of approaching the area and feeling a heaviness of air, as though chains rattled unseen. One overseer resigned from his post entirely, claiming he heard footsteps following him through the fields long after sundown. He told a neighbor, "It is as if Elijah walks still, and he waits for me in the rows." The enslaved who had fled that night, how many survived? Some were captured, dragged back in chains, their punishment never recorded but left to grim imagination. Others disappeared entirely, perhaps swallowed by swamp, perhaps guided north along hidden trails. According to one fragment in the archives of the Alabama Historical Society, a farmer decades later claimed to have met a man with scars about his wrists who called himself Elijah and who vanished again come morning. Whether truth or folklore, the story pressed on like breath in the dark. By winter, the big house had fallen into disrepair. Servants reported that no matter how much lye they poured, the floorboards still carried a dark stain. Guests refused to stay overnight, claiming they heard knives scrape across wood in the silence, though no blade was present. The mistress, broken by grief or madness, was said to wander the halls whispering, "He stands behind me still." neighbors began to speak not only of rebellion but of haunting. Could vengeance echo, they asked, even when flesh was gone? Was Elijah's hand still present, reaching through the walls, dragging the living into memory, or was it simply guilt, festering like rot, staining everything it touched? For the enslaved, the haunting was hope. One cut and we all breathe became a murmur carried in the night, not just Elijah's words but a promise that silence could always be broken, that chains were never eternal. And yet each act of defiance brought harsher laws, tighter grips. Patrols doubled, punishments grew more brutal, suspicion hung over every quiet glance. Masters lived with pistols by their beds, mistresses with candles burning all night. But in their fears they revealed what they never dared admit aloud, that they were outnumbered, that power was fragile, that vengeance could walk into their dining rooms at any moment. So what then became of Elijah? Was he captured and strung up beneath an oak tree, his body left as warning? Was he a ghost in the swamp, watching with eyes that never closed? Or did he find the impossible freedom, a new name and silence that was no longer forced but chosen? History does not say, but the silence itself feels like an answer, one as chilling as any written word. What shadows did this act leave across Alabama's plantations? Was it a rebellion of one, or the mark of something greater, a hidden resistance threading beneath the fields? By the turn of the next year, the story of Elijah had spread far beyond Alabama. It traveled in whispers through slave quarters from Virginia to Louisiana, crossing rivers, carried by traders, whispered in fields under the drone of cicadas. For some, it was told as warning, the tale of a man who struck too boldly and paid the ultimate price. For others, it was told as gospel proof that the chains could break, that one hand could shift the balance of power, even if only for a moment. In Alabama itself, the plantation where the dinner took place never truly recovered. Records show that by 1842, the land had been sold off in parcels, the big house left crumbling. Local children avoided it, claiming shadows moved in its windows long after it was abandoned. Preachers, when pressed, admitted to hearing rumors of voices echoing in the dining hall, whispers of prayers cut short, laughter strangled mid-breath. Some called it haunted, others called it justice. The truth lay tangled between the two. Newspapers attempted to bury the story, yet fragments lingered. The Montgomery Advertiser referenced the Elijah affair as late as 1845, though it couched the incident in careful words, calling it a disturbance rather than a revolt. Meanwhile, oral histories within black families preserved the sharper truth. According to testimonies collected a century later during the WPA Slave Narratives Project, elders recalled hearing their grandparents speak of a man named Elijah who set the table red and opened the way for freedom. To them, he was less criminal than prophet. Fear, however, left its own mark. After the incident, militia presence across Alabama intensified. Laws tightened, forbidding gatherings, restricting movement, adding weight to every chain. Masters insisted these measures were to preserve order, yet their hands trembled at night, pistols kept closer, candles burned longer. In their dread, they revealed what Elijah's blade had already shown, that their power was fragile, dependent on silence, and silence could be broken. In some versions of the tale, Elijah was captured and executed publicly. A broadside poster, now lost but once catalogued in the archives of Selma, reportedly described a hanging witnessed by hundreds, meant to demonstrate the consequences of disobedience. Yet no surviving court record proves his death. Other accounts suggest he escaped into the swamps, guided by free blacks and sympathetic hands, eventually slipping north through the Underground Railroad. Still others claim he lived on the margins, appearing briefly, then vanishing again like smoke. And so his fate remains suspended, a story without a period at the end. Perhaps that is why it endures. Neighbors of the plantation spoke of eerie signs long after. One woman claimed the well water turned red during summer heat, though no rust was found in the pail. Another swore that the church bell tolled 13 times at midnight on the anniversary of the dinner, though no hand touched its rope. Whether exaggeration, folklore, or guilt-given form, the community could not silence the echoes. Elijah's act was carved into the land itself. For the enslaved, it became a secret banner, not a rebellion in numbers, but a rebellion in memory. A reminder that submission was never absolute, that even within the heart of chains there could be fire. Elders spoke softly of Elijah as a warning and a promise. One cut and we all breathe. Hit like if this tale of defiance still chills you to the bone. Today, historians debate what truly happened that night in Alabama. Was Elijah's blade the spark of an organized resistance, hidden but ready to rise? Or was it the desperate act of one man, a sudden burst of rage against a lifetime of cruelty? The evidence is scattered, the records muffled, the truth half erased. Yet perhaps that very uncertainty is what makes the story endure. Because whether Elijah lived or died, whether his name was recorded or erased, his act remains. It echoes in every chain that rattled, in every master's dream turned sour, in every whisper carried through the quarters that said, "Freedom is not impossible, not even here." And so the plantation rotted, and so the fields grew silent, and so Elijah's story walked on, no longer bound to one night, but alive in memory, in folklore, in the shadows of history. Was Elijah a man of flesh and blood who dared what others feared, or has time transformed him into something more, a symbol of vengeance, a spirit of rebellion, a ghost carried on southern winds? Was his fate coincidence, conspiracy, or curse? The answer may never be written, but the silence he shattered has never fully returned. Even now, some claim that on humid nights in Alabama, the cicadas fall silent, and from the distance comes the faint scrape of a knife across wood. Some say the air grows heavy, the smell of blood and iron clings, and the church bell rings once for a dinner that never finished. Whether true or imagined, it is a reminder that the past does not sleep, it waits. And if you want more stories where chains break, where silence screams, and where forgotten rebellions walk again, subscribe now to the Unchained Past and follow us deeper into the shadows.